Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the last episode, I talked about Thomas Jefferson's troubled second term, mostly focusing on how we got embroiled into a trade war, effectively, with Britain and France, and kind of the whole rest of the world for a little while because of the Embargo Act, and the ways in which that did not work. I also discussed the Sally Hemings scandal, where that came from, how much truth there was to it, and how it got out into the open. This is kind of another special episode. I'm going to focus on one issue in particular, and that is slavery. Specifically, how did slavery persist? How did it survive? How did it endure in the United States past the Revolution, which of course had all of this rhetoric and all of these noble ideas about all men being created equal and the United States founding a government that would fight for the liberty of all mankind, influenced by all of the ideas that came from the Enlightenment about natural rights and so forth. How did the United States hold on to the institution of slavery, and not just hold on to it, but actually expand it from the position where it had been before the Revolution to being a much bigger part of the United States by 1820, 1830 than it had been before? I think the question that you want to focus on at this point is, what were the factors that led to the expansion of slavery? Why didn't it die out with the Revolution and all of the high-minded ideals that were behind the Revolution? And what specifically may have been done to prevent it expanding, if anything could have been done? That's always interesting to contemplate a historical what if. For this show, I'm really using mostly one chapter in particular of Empire of Liberty, although all the other books that I've read about, whether it's The Art of Power by Thomas Jefferson, or Give Me Liberty, the textbook, or The American Pageant, or what have you, they all have pieces of this story. But I thought that the Empire of Liberty book, the one by Gordon S. Wood, which focuses on the period between ratification of the Constitution and 1815, it's the book in the Oxford History of the United States series that covers that period. It has a chapter that focuses on this that I thought was remarkably well done, and that I thought presented a very good argument, enough information for me to focus a particular episode on it. So a lot of what I'm going to discuss here comes from that book, though not all of it. I sort of look at it like this. If you had asked the Founding Fathers around 1787 whether slavery was on its way out, most of them, I think, would have said yes. Not immediately, not tomorrow, but eventually they thought slavery was going to be gone. The assumption, especially in the Upper South, and by that I mean like Maryland, Virginia, that part of the United States, was that slavery was a dying institution. It was economically inefficient. It was morally complicated, if not morally repugnant. It was politically dangerous. And yet, by 1830, slavery was not only still around, it was ubiquitous in the southern states and only growing in importance. So what happened? Today, I'm going to dig into that, the reasons why slavery did not fade away in the early 19th century. And it's not because there weren't a substantial number of people, many of whom you've heard about your whole life, who aggressively pushed to rid the country of slavery altogether. In fact, the very first anti-slavery society in the entire world met in Philadelphia in 1775. But for a variety of reasons, including the rapidly increasing demand for cotton from Europe, the invention of the cotton gin, deep-seated fear of slave uprisings throughout the South, augmented substantially in that period by the Haitian Revolution and the pernicious growth of ideas of white supremacy in the early 1800s, slavery endured. In fact, not only did slavery survive the rhetoric about equality and natural human rights associated with the American Revolution, it actually expanded substantially, and by 1830 was deeply entrenched in the social, political, and economic structures of the United States. So, how did that happen? As I've discussed in multiple prior episodes, slavery was not a monolith in the British North American colonies or in the independent United States, and I think we have to go back to that point to really understand, to have the context to understand why it was that slavery ended up lasting beyond the Revolution. It could, slavery, and did, take on very different manifestations depending on the particular state or county in which slavery existed. Slavery in what would be the United States was dramatically different from what it looked like in the rest of the Western Hemisphere. Overall, about 200,000 slaves were imported to any location in what would be the United States, which was less than 5% of the 10 to 12 million slaves brought from Africa to the mostly sugar-producing regions of the Caribbean and Brazil in the Western Hemisphere. Slave owners in the United States relied on the natural reproduction of slaves already in the region rather than on constantly importing new slaves, as was the case in the rest of the New World. The mortality rates were much higher on sugar plantations in the tropics, as conditions were even more brutal than in North America, where slaves were seen as less disposable imports and more as valuable commodities. That's in North America. Slaves were seen as more of an investment rather than something that could be used and abused and thrown away when it was done. Either way, it was horrible, but in the Latin American portion of the Western Hemisphere, where sugar production was the main activity of enslaved labor, they just weren't looked at as something that was going to last, the slaves that were imported. As the American Revolution began, there were about 450,000 slaves in what would be the United States, or about 1/5 of the population. Virginia had the largest number of slaves at 188,000 of any of the colonies soon-to-be states, but South Carolina had the highest proportion of its population as African-descended slaves, at about 60%, or 75,000 out of a population of about 124,000. Every colony had slaves. Every state had slaves when they became states. There were about 50,000 slaves in northern states in 1770, though 90% of slaves in the 13 colonies were in the South. If you want some estimates about what the slave populations were in the North, about 9% of the city of Philadelphia was enslaved, about 8% of the people in the state colony of Rhode Island were enslaved. That was a big importation center, Rhode Island was, of slaves to the northern part of the colonies/states, and about 7% of people in New Jersey were enslaved. New York was probably most impacted by slavery of all the northern colonies or states. 12% of the colony's population and 14% of the city's people were slaves. And as late as 1790, 1/5, 20%, however you want to think of it, of households in New York City owned at least one slave. In fact, because there were very few families in the colony with more than 10 slaves, in New York with more than 10 slaves, a greater percentage of white households in New York City and its surrounding counties owned slaves, about 40%, than was the case in either Maryland, where it was about 36.5%, and even in South Carolina, where it was 34%. That's because in places like Maryland and South Carolina, there were more families that had over 100 slaves. So slaves were less spread out among fewer owners in South Carolina, Georgia, places like that, than they were in New York, where people tended to own only a handful of slaves, if they owned any. Of course, the much greater number of slaves in those southern colonies and then states meant that there were going to be many more large plantations with populations over 100 slaves. This was particularly the case in aristocratic South Carolina, where plantation land, wealth, and therefore the slave labor thought necessary to extract wealth were concentrated among about 20% of the population, who dominated the low country of South Carolina. The coastal areas basically where rice plantations were situated, and it was on these rice plantations where the vast majority of slaves in South Carolina worked and lived. But even among the southern colonies, there were substantial differences in the culture, labor, and demographics of slaves. In Virginia and Maryland, for example, slaves were much more likely to be born in the colony. That is, they were not imported from outside what would be the United States. They were also more likely to live on smaller plantations or farms that grew tobacco or wheat. They were more likely to have more varied working tasks as slaves and to have closer relationships with their masters than in South Carolina, where the plantations were larger. The owners were often absentee landlords who weren't there for at least the summer months, if not the entire year. And the labor on these South Carolina plantations was more centrally focused on producing as much rice as possible. South Carolina slaves also were much more likely to be male and born in Africa, and that explains not only why so many more of them were imported, but why there was a lack of natural reproduction, as was the case in like Virginia, Maryland. There were a number of totally logical reasons to think that slavery was on the wane in the early United States, just after the Revolution had ended. So many Americans believed slavery was on its way out in the 1780s and 90s, probably most obviously because it was terribly difficult to reconcile the language of all men being created equal and the notion that the United States was fighting for liberty with the institution of slavery. It's very difficult to make those two make sense together, right? How we do it now is I mean, that's the big kind of conundrum I think a lot of people looking back at the Revolution have now. It's like, wait, so you're talking about liberty and freedom, but you got all these enslaved people, and people in England were not shy about saying the same thing at the time that the revolution was going on, by the way. It's just hard to say that you're fighting for liberty when 20% of your population is enslaved, you know what I mean? But in addition to that conflict of ideas between slavery and men being created equal and you're fighting for liberty, tobacco agriculture, which was dominant in states like Virginia and Maryland, was clearly declining by the late 18th century. Farmers found soil exhausted. Tobacco is a very land-hungry crop. As it turns out, it sucks the nutrients out of the soil pretty quickly, and that means that you got to go find new land or you got to leave the fields fallow for a while, which isn't great in terms of efficiency for making profits by shipping your crop overseas. Yields were shrinking because of that, and profits were dwindling. Many of these farmers whose ancestors had grown tobacco dating back to the early to mid 1600s, including, by the way, George Washington, transitioned to growing wheat where they had once raised tobacco, and they often found that slave labor was unreliable and ill-suited to these changes from tobacco growing to raising wheat. George Washington wrote on numerous occasions about how his slaves did not labor as efficiently when he was away as when he was there. And he came to believe that slave labor was just always going to be inferior to the labor of free people because he realized slaves had no incentive to do anything. Why would they? George Washington also expressed discomfort with slavery, criticized it, as I said, as inefficient, and he wasn't alone. Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, and James Madison were all fellow Southern planters, all from Virginia, by the way, who expressed moral objections to slavery and pushed in varying ways and with various levels of enthusiasm to rid the United States of slavery, mostly through gradual emancipation. Not all of a sudden we're going to pass a law and everybody's going to be free, but we're going to do it over generations, let's say. Washington freed his slaves in his will, signaling broader trends of many slave owners in Maryland, Virginia, and the Upper South of freeing slaves in the 1790s, after the Revolution was over, rather than selling them or hiring them out to work for others, which was something that a lot of Virginia, Maryland slave owners did, is they hired out their slaves to labor in other places because they just didn't have much use for them anymore. They had too many. There was a general push in the 1780s, 1790s for manumission, which means slaves being able to buy their own freedom, somebody else being able to buy their freedom for them, courts setting them free, or slave owners just voluntarily letting them go and not demanding anything in return. In most southern states, except for South Carolina and Virginia, there was quite militant resistance to manumission, to ending slavery in those states, because slavery was much more important on rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia than it had been at the time for tobacco planters or wheat planters in Virginia and Maryland. Those at the Constitutional Convention who wanted to push for the abolition of slavery realized that they either had to choose between abolition on the one hand and with it the secession of multiple states, like Georgia and South Carolina in particular, from the Union, or acceptance of slavery at least for some period of time, and they chose the latter. Northern states began gradual abolition. First it was Pennsylvania in 1780, and then the Massachusetts State Supreme Court ruled in 1783, the same year that the Revolutionary War ended, that slavery was totally incompatible with the Massachusetts state constitution. The other New England states mostly followed Massachusetts' lead by outlawing slavery immediately. Although Vermont was the first to technically do so in 1777, it wasn't a state just yet. New York and New Jersey followed Pennsylvania's lead of gradual emancipation, although it was very gradual in the case of both states. Particularly in New York City, where a law was passed for gradual emancipation in 1799, but still had in New York City about 40% of households with at least one slave in 1810. By that same year, 1810, there were well over 100,000 free blacks in northern states, up from 27,000 in 1790. Many states had individually abolished the slave trade in the 1770s or 1780s, and the Constitutional Convention etched into the new governmental blueprint that the importation of slaves into the United States from outside the country would be made illegal after 1808. Congress passed and Jefferson signed into law the Act prohibiting the importation of slaves in March 1807 to give form to this declaration of the Constitution, that is, that the slave trade would end, the international slave trade would end in 1808. More informally, slaves, free blacks, and all classes of white people, though mostly lower class whites, poorer whites, were mixing together socially and professionally all over the country in the 1780s and 1790s as all the revolutionary ideals were still very potent. This was especially true in Virginia and Maryland and among the poor whites and enslaved or newly free blacks, who often attended horse races, cockfights, and social gatherings like dances together. They drank, they played music, and they thought of each other as roughly on the same social level in the very hierarchical Southern societies, which were dominated by these wealthy planter aristocrats that I've mentioned over and again, who saw themselves in an entirely different light than anyone else, white or black, in their states. But the seeds were planted, pardon the pun, for an economic shift in the United States that would reinvigorate the institution of slavery all over the southern states, especially in newer states west of the Appalachians. Enter Eli Whitney and the cotton gin that he invented in 1793. Before Whitney's invention, short staple cotton was unprofitable due to the tedious seed removal process. Southerners dreamed of being able to remove these sticky seeds and other parts of the plant that hindered harvesting its valuable bolls, but it was just too awkward and labor-intensive to make it lucrative. Whitney's gin, which cleaned cotton at a rate much faster than could be accomplished by human hands alone, made short staple cotton highly profitable on an industrial scale. That meant that farmers could make a fortune, taking advantage of the explosion of demand for raw cotton in textile mills of Western Europe, as short staple cotton could be produced most anywhere south of Virginia. Vast, previously marginal territories in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana became booming cotton regions, and the thirst for new land to bring under cotton cultivation was matched only by the demand for more slave labor to harvest, clean, and package the cotton for shipment either to the northeastern United States or, much more likely, ultimately all the way to Western Europe. This meant that the now excess slaves that had been thought of as candidates for manumission in Virginia and Maryland became instead valuable sources of labor for sale, at first to Kentucky, which was trying to just get established as a new state, and farmers were looking for any help they could get with whatever they were growing, and then ultimately, much more commonly, to the cotton-producing regions further south, like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, etc. The Upper South transformed from tobacco plantations and large-scale wheat farms with extra slave labor for rents into exports of enslaved people for sale, fueling the notorious domestic slave trade and reshaping America's demographic landscape, even as importation of slaves into the United States from outside the country declined and eventually evaporated in the early 1800s. There's a notable exception when there was a big expansion of slave importation into specifically South Carolina. There's a big harbor in South Carolina in Charleston that was very important at the time, mostly for importation of slaves or export of rice. And a lot of these slaves that were imported into South Carolina came from either the West Indies or from Africa. And from 1803 to 1807, about 40,000 slaves were imported into South Carolina. But that is definitely an outlier compared to slave importation in the rest of the United States in that period. As all of this transpired in the South, Americans in the northern states were largely engaged in acts of self-deception or were obscured from the realities of human bondage in the United States. White Americans of all classes in northern states were convinced that the end of slave importation from outside the country meant that slavery was dying. This is even as the domestic slave trade ramped up from a trickle to a gushing river of unfree African Americans being shipped west and south of the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, and so forth. It wasn't until about the time of the War of 1812 that some political leaders in northern states, many of whom vehemently opposed slavery, came to realize what was happening. And by that time, and especially by about 1820, slavery had become too well established and plantation owners had become too wealthy and too politically powerful, especially with the assistance of the 3/5 clause of the Constitution. That's what gave them a lot of their political power, that they could count slaves for population purposes and give themselves more representatives in Congress and more voice in the Electoral College. All of that meant that Northerners opposed to slavery could not stop the dominance of plantation economics that depended on black slavery. So cotton turned slavery into a cornerstone of American capitalism and fueled the rise of a nationwide market economy in which different regions of the country began to specialize ever more pointedly in different forms of economic activity. And the growth of cotton on plantations was a big piece of all of that. Apart from the economic evolution taking place in the U.S., there were political reasons for why slavery became reestablished and re-entrenched in American society, and they had largely to do with nagging anxiety about slave uprisings. A big reason for a lot of this anxiety was the Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 and which did not fully come to a conclusion until 1804. Led by, I'm going to try this, so please forgive me if I sound like a total idiot while I'm saying this, but led by Toussaint Louverture, or Toussaint Louverture, who was I believe a former slave that became this really impressive military general. Enslaved people overthrew French rule, creating the first free black republic. But it wasn't as easy as all that. There were years of fighting and many instances of whites being massacred by slaves who rose up to overthrow their condition when they learned of the French Revolution or of uprisings on neighboring plantations in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Many of the refugees seeking to escape this violence and chaos in Haiti, Saint-Domingue, eventually found their way to some part of the United States, and their stories, whether they came from white plantation owners or free blacks who might or might not have owned slaves themselves, were terrifying to white slave owners everywhere. The effect of this conflict and the stories of those who'd fled Saint-Domingue for the United States was impactful on slave-owning whites all over the U.S., but was profoundly impressive on the big plantation owners of the South, who were vastly outnumbered by their slaves in many instances and lived in some counties where the ratio of enslaved blacks to free whites might have been as high as 10-1, even higher in some places. Additionally, there were slave rebellions that broke out in the 1790s in various parts of the Western Hemisphere, not just in Haiti, Saint-Domingue, but in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in Grenada, in Venezuela, and even on mainland North America in parts of Spanish Louisiana. The implications for slaveholders in the United States were pretty obvious. Then there is what is called Gabriel's Rebellion. Though every U.S. state but Virginia subsequently banned slaves from Saint-Domingue from crossing into their borders, that did not stop the burgeoning slave revolts from manifesting themselves in the South. In Richmond, Virginia, a 24-year-old blacksmith named Gabriel Prosser, who was part of a recently emerging class of enslaved artisans who enjoyed a greater degree of freedom and mobility than most slaves in the United States ever had before, he made up his mind that he could no longer suffer the indignities of slavery. As much as he may have been in a better position than some of his contemporaries, or certainly than his ancestors, he wasn't free. And with all the idealistic talk about freedom and liberty and all men being created equal, it's not difficult to imagine why he must have felt his situation intolerable. Prosser and those who conspired with him dreamed of exciting a large-scale Republican revolution of both enslaved blacks and free blacks on the one hand, and poor whites on the other hand, that would come together to end their collective exploitation at the hands of wealthy landowners and merchants who they saw as totally taking advantage of all of them. While Gabriel hoped poor whites would join in the uprising, he vowed that those not joining the insurrection would die if they got in the way, excepting, quote, Quakers, Methodists, and French people, unquote, who he saw as being, quote, more friendly to liberty, unquote. Around April of 1800, Prosser and his co-conspirators began recruiting potential participants in the rebellion from taverns and from religious meetings. It is believed that as many as 600 people agreed, orally at least, to join in the effort. Dozens of individuals made swords from scythes, stole and stored guns, and planned to set fires in the warehouse district of Richmond as a distraction so that they could march on the Virginia State Treasury, where a large cache of weapons was stored. But on the day designated, August 30th, 2 slaves informed their masters of the plot, and dozens were arrested over the course of the next several weeks. Many Virginians had initially been dismissive of the conspiracy, but as the arrest ballooned, and as Gabriel and 26 others were hanged for fomenting insurrection, and as others were sold out of the area, the harsh reality of the hostility that the enslaved held toward their masters couldn't be denied. It was jarring, especially because it had originated from slaves with some of the most liberal treatment. That threw a lot of elite whites for a loop. They sort of had this attitude of, whoa, they've got it so good. Why on earth would they rebel against us? You can see the arrogance in that and the total lack of empathy that would have led to those kinds of conclusions. And you sort of understand why things progressed the way they did. In the aftermath of this aborted insurrection, Virginia in particular, and the southern states in general, reacted by enacting harsh restrictions against black gatherings, education, and mobility. A new set of black codes and segregation laws that resembled the later Jim Crow laws were put into effect, and manumissions fell off a cliff. In 1806, the Virginia legislature passed a law mandating that any freed slaves, that is, slaves from Virginia who had been freed in Virginia, were not even allowed to remain in Virginia afterward. And Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky passed their own laws prohibiting slaves freed in Virginia from settling within their borders. The era of liberalizing the lives of the enslaved was over. There's another piece to this too, though. As the economy became more entangled with slavery because of the explosion of the Cotton Kingdom, and as reactions to the Haitian Revolution and Gabriel's Rebellion reverberated throughout North and South in the United States, the way many Americans talked about human rights and equality of mankind began to change quite dramatically. In the South, it became impossible to justify the Enlightenment rhetoric of natural rights with the growing institution of slavery. So there needed to be some way to make it compatible, that is, slavery compatible, with the values put forward in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, among all the other American treatises on classical liberalism that espoused natural rights of humanity. The obvious way to reconcile these incompatible ideas, slavery and the Enlightenment ideals of natural rights of human beings, was to claim that people of African ancestry were not, in fact, the equals of white people, and that slavery was a way of civilizing them. This notion of white superiority was coupled with the notion that African slaves were actually genetically destined to be slaves. Figures like Thomas Jefferson, who once described slavery as morally problematic, increasingly argued that African descendants were intellectually and morally inferior to whites and incapable of Republican citizenship. Jefferson declared that blacks' deficiencies were innate, because when they had children with whites, according to Jefferson, the offspring became, quote, better in body and mind. And so this, quote, proves that their inferiority is not the effect merely of their condition of life, unquote. Pretty fucking gross. Jefferson did express uncertainty about his racial inferiority conclusions and hedged his racism a little, saying, quote, as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in endowments of both body and mind. Now, that doesn't sound like a hedge, but it's very much what he was trying to do in the larger context of the other things that he was saying. Pseudoscience emerged in the early 1800s that formed the basis of scientific racism that came to dominate the antebellum period, the period leading up to the Civil War. And all of that claimed, the pseudoscience, that African slaves had no inherent capacity for freedom. I don't even know what the fuck that means. And that slaveholders thus had a Christian patriarchal responsibility to care for them. Of course, we must take care of these lowly African souls. Ugh. By 1830, white supremacy was no longer a byproduct, it had become foundational, justifying not only slavery, but also aggressive expansion, exploitation, and segregation of African Americans, not just in the South. These ideas spread all over the country and infected most parts of white society in every region, not just in the cotton-producing southern states dominated by these aristocratic plantation owners. And what's even weirder about all this is that many whites simultaneously believed in white supremacy and objected strenuously to slavery. Can you imagine holding those two ideas in your head? It's like, slavery is evil, but yeah, whites are superior to black people. But it's a thing. Look at it. That's something I'm going to get into a lot more when I get to the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, how some of these people managed to hold these ideas in their head at the same time in a way that is just kind of inconceivable to most of us now. So the importance of slavery came to be entrenched not just in the South, but in the North as well, through white supremacy and the economic ties between the cotton-producing South and the more commercial North. The institution of slavery evolved, but was deeply entrenched everywhere, even as a significant part of the economy of northern states, which came to incorporate elements of cotton export and production into their own economies, and as some northern states began to build their own textile mills. Southern states became profoundly undemocratic as more and more power collected in the upper reaches of the planter aristocracy, who dominated the economy through their large cotton plantations made functional by slave labor, and who dominated the political arena by limiting the voting influence of poor whites in state and local government. So it wasn't just people of African ancestry who were hurt by slavery. The whole political institution of southern states became less democratic. And it makes sense when you think about it. If you are willing to accept something as obviously undemocratic and unjust as chattel slavery, it's not going to be a real big jump ethically, morally, politically to just hold all the political power to yourself and your class. That's not that big of a leap to make. So it's not surprising that wealthy whites who owned plantations came to utterly dominate southern states. And it's a big part of the reason why some whites during the Civil War sided with the Union. It wasn't because they were abolitionists or even because they disagree with slavery or even disagree with white supremacy. It was often because they hated the wealthy planter aristocrats who they saw as looking down their noses at them all the time. And there's a lot of truth to that. The wealthy planter aristocrats did look down their noses at poor white people all the time. As these planter aristocrats gained oligarchic control over the levers of state and local government, they moved to protect the existence of slavery that was so vital to their interests. They punched above their weight in national politics too, not just at the local and state level, again, due to the 3/5 clause of the Constitution that gave Southern states greater influence in the House of Representatives and in the Electoral College because it counted people for population purposes, therefore giving more weight to these Southern states who weren't even citizens. But it did give them 60% of the political weight of a citizen for counting purposes. States like Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, and Delaware maintained slavery through diverse roles, domestic work, crafts, mining, stuff like that, but remained economically dependent on enslaved labor for still farming tobacco that didn't disappear altogether, and grains like wheat, mostly. As slavery's importance grew, it became increasingly inconceivable to eliminate it, especially among the politically influential planter class of the South who jealously guarded their peculiar institution. That's the euphemism that Southerners gave to the institution of slavery as the lifeblood of their tremendous fortunes. They became, did these Southern planters, the wealthiest and most politically powerful men in the United States before the railroad, oil, steel, and other titans of industry came to replace them after the Civil War. And they, these wealthy planters, forced Americans everywhere to accept slavery, whether many Americans wanted it or not. And as you will see when we get there, abolitionism became a very powerful political movement in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, up to the Civil War. But truthfully, most Americans either endorsed slavery or at least looked the other way until the 1840s. And even those that found the institution disgraceful mostly did not object to the notions of white supremacy that were born out of efforts to keep millions in chains for nearly the first century of the United States' existence as an independent country, allegedly founded on the principles of liberty for mankind and that all men were created equal. So in conclusion, I guess you'd say that around 1800, Americans faced a critical decision point. Gradual emancipation was possible, but overshadowed by cotton profits, fear of slave rebellion, and a growing belief in white supremacy. Rather than fading, slavery expanded, deepened, and shaped the United States profoundly. So, the next time someone asks why slavery endured in a liberty-founded nation, remember, it was about cotton, fear, deliberate choices, and tragically, the embrace of racism in the early 1800s. I'm sure a lot of this was hard to hear. Much as I am a proud American and appreciate a lot of things about our country now and in our history, this is most definitely not a proud piece of that history. But I hope you found it informative, and I hope that you will like, subscribe, and spread the word so that I can keep bringing this vital history to so many Americans who, for one reason or another, aren't aware of just how the hell we got here. Thanks as always for listening. Hope to see you all next time. Take care, and until then,